By the time the sun clawed its way over the ridge, Willow Creek had already gone quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to snow. Not the gentle hush of snowfall softening roofs or the muffled laughter of kids building forts. This was the kind of silence that settled into bone and made people look over their shoulders. It was the kind of silence that came when something was missing. Cassie Marrow should have noticed it sooner. She was running behind again. 2 cups of coffee, deep and still barely keeping pace with her 6-year-old twins, Ava and Nora, who were currently arguing over who got to wear the sparkly earmuffs. Cassie didn't care, just as long as they made it to daycare before her shift started. Being late at Willow Creek Medical meant losing hours, and when you were a single mom trying to pay off a mountain of hospital bills and stretch one paycheck across 3 lives, that mattered. She bundled them into the SUV, half laughed, half shouted, and peeled down Sycamore Lane, tires crunching over the fresh snow. The sky above was a slab of steel. Forecast said more snow was coming, but Cassie didn't worry. They'd seen worse. The daycare sat at the edge of town, a converted chapel with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, Little Pines Learning Center. Miss Darlene waved from the porch, bundled in layers, her face soft with that same pitying smile Cassie had come to resent. "Morning, girls," she called. "Ready to make snow angels?" Ava nodded. Nora launched into a half-spoken story about how her snowman was going to have a crown this time. Cassie leaned down, fixed Nora's scarf, kissed Ava's forehead. "Be good. Stick together." They always did. It wasn't until 11:12 a.m. that everything shattered. Cassie was midway through charting vitals when her phone rang. She didn't answer until it rang again and again. "Cassie," Miss Darlene's voice came through, breathless, cracking. "They're gone. The girls, we can't find them." The hospital floor tilted. Cassie's pen dropped. "What do you mean, gone?" "They were building a fort out back. I turned around for maybe 2 minutes and then they weren't there. There's nothing. Just footprints heading into the woods." The sycamore woods. Cassie didn't remember grabbing her coat, didn't remember screaming. Just snow under her boots, the edge of town blurring past, a panic so large it swallowed her thoughts whole. By the time she reached the daycare, the entire town was already moving. Willow Creek might have been quiet most days, but not when it came to its own. Snowmobiles fired up. Volunteers laced boots. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off a perimeter that meant nothing in the face of thick forest and failing daylight. That's when someone mentioned Jack Holloway. "Won't come," someone muttered. "He hasn't been the same since the Hollow Ridge case. He still got Max? Heard the dog's half crippled now, too old." But Jack came anyway. He showed up at the edge of the search grid just past noon, his leg braced in steel and leather, a limp built into his gait. The coat he wore looked like it hadn't been zipped in years, and beside him padded Maxold, battered, silent, one ear chewed to hell, hind legs stiff, eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Max had been trained to track blood, scent, gunpowder, had once pulled 3 children from a collapsed church in Clay County. That was before the injury, before retirement. But Max didn't look like he was done yet. Jack barely said a word. Just held out his hand to Miss Darlene, who numbly gave him Ava's dropped mitten. Max sniffed it once, then turned toward the woods, and ran. Jack followed, fast as his body would allow, snow crunching under his boots, radio on his belt flickering in and out. But the forest swallowed signals the way it swallowed sound completely. The Sycamore Ridge loomed. Max veered down a deer trail, nose low, tail taut. He moved with focus, not speed, like he already knew something the rest of them didn't. 300 yards in, they found the first clue. A broken plastic unicorn, half buried in the snow. One wing missing, smeared with red. Not blood, cherry-flavored cough syrup. Ava had a bottle in her coat, Cassie had said. Jack pocketed the toy. Max growled. Not the angry kind, the warning kind. They were being watched. At the tree line, the dog stopped, head high, ears forward. Jack lifted his binoculars and scanned. Nothing. Then something, a shape. Far off, almost hidden. A lean figure in heavy gear dragging something behind him. Then another shape, shorter, moving slower. A child? Jack raised the radio. 2 suspects, 1 adult, 1 unknown, heading northeast past marker 7. Static, the cold, made it hard to breathe. Max let out a low, throaty bark, just once, and far away, in a rotting shack with boarded windows and a rusted chain across the door, Ava Merrow blinked awake. Her hands were tied. Nora lay beside her, whimpering in her sleep, cheeks flushed with fever. It was dark, freezing. The floor smelled like mold and bleach. Someone had come and gone, left food maybe. But the last time she'd screamed, they'd hit the wall hard enough to make her stop. She didn't scream anymore. Instead, Ava reached out with her fingers and tapped once on the wooden floorboards. Then twice, then 3 times. A rhythm. Not loud, but steady. The kind of sound you made when you were too afraid to speak. The kind of sound a dog might hear. And miles away, Max turned his head, ears twitching. He'd heard it. He knew. Jack saw it in the way Max's muscles shifted. He was on scent again. Deeper now. Urgent. Toward something that didn't want to be found. The forest around them remained silent. But beneath the snow, something had answered. And for the first time that day, Jack let himself believe they still had a chance. The further they pressed into the woods, the more it felt like the world behind them had stopped existing. No hum of distant engines, no scattered voices calling names through pine and wind. Not even the sound of birdsong that usually trailed them this deep in the forest. Only the rhythmic crunch of snow under boots and paws, and the hollow feeling in Jack Holloway's gut that told him they were moving not just into the wild, but into something that didn't want to be found. Max had been silent for the last mile, his body taut, head low, ears tuned to some frequency Jack couldn't hear, and though his limp had worsened over the incline, he hadn't slowed, hadn't paused, hadn't once looked back, as if some invisible thread were pulling him forward, some scent or sound or memory older than training and deeper than instinct. The cabin appeared the way traps often do, sudden, quiet, and wrong. It wasn't listed on any maps, not marked by the forestry department, not in any of the old records Jack still kept in a locked drawer back at the cabin, and yet it sat there beneath the sweep of a sycamore grove, squat and low, and buried under the weight of snow and secrets, its windows boarded from the inside, its roof patched with scrap tin and plastic sheeting, its chimney blackened but still warm. Jack crouched low, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, letting the scent hit him before he spoke. Bleach, ammonia, and the faint, sickly sweetness of rotting wood masked by something sharper, like antiseptic poured over something that refused to stay clean. Max's snarl started low, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to rattle the stillness. They circled wide, Jack signaling the old way 2 fingers to the eyes, one point left, the other right, just like he had back in the days when backup meant someone actually answered your call. And then, as Max vanished behind the collapsed porch, Jack crept to the side window and peered through the crack in the boards. He didn't see much, just the flicker of movement, and a shadow dragging something across the floor. It was enough. He reached for his radio, tapped the transmit twice, and hissed out coordinates through the static, knowing full well the signal would die before it hit the tower, but praying someone was scanning the right channel at the right time. When he turned back to the cabin, Max was already there, pressed flat beneath a broken timber beam, eyes locked on the side door that someone had left slightly ajar. An invitation or a trap? Jack couldn't tell. They didn't go in, not yet. Because something about the place felt curated, scrubbed down, rearranged, cleaned but not clean, and Jack had kicked down enough doors in his time to recognize when someone wanted a scene found a certain way. So instead, he reached into his pack, pulled out the drone, a small, black wasp of a thing, with infrared and a low-buzz camera, and sent it rising into the tree line, where it caught the thermal signature of two figures moving inside. One tall, one smaller, both shifting around a lump on the floor. Jack's stomach dropped. Across town, in a cluttered bookstore no one visited, unless they were lost, or lonely, or looking for something that didn't exist anymore, Edie Bellamy stared at the child's drawing for the fourth time, her knuckles white around the edge of the paper, her breath shallow in a way she hadn't let it be since the day her son's pack was found without his body near the foot of Echo Ravine 6 years prior. The drawing was simple childish lines in dark blue crayon, a circle with jagged edges and a vertical slash through its center. But to Edie, it was as familiar as the way her son used to hum when he was nervous, or the way he wrote lowercase e's like tiny backwards threes in the margins of every notebook he ever owned. She pulled out Simon's old journal from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet she hadn't opened since the search was called off, and when she flipped to the third page, she found it there again. The same symbol, hand-sketched in pencil, annotated with the words, "Marked tree near Sycamore North." Not a forestry code. Possible private tag. Reappears east of line boundary. Ask about Voss. The name hit like a slap. She remembered the way Simon had said it once, just once, over breakfast. Eyes red-rimmed from a late patrol, fingers trembling as he poured coffee, muttering about a man who had too many keys and no name on his jacket. About records that didn't match. About land leases that shifted across counties like someone was trying to erase something buried under the dirt. Raymond Voss, it had sounded made up then, too sharp to be real. Like a villain from a cheap crime novel. But now, Edie locked the door to the shop, threw her coat over her shoulders, and drove straight to the Willow Creek substation where Captain Renshaw hadn't aged so much as solidified, his face creased with lines carved by years of cases half solved and truths never spoken aloud. She didn't knock, didn't ask, just slammed Simon's journal on his desk and said, "He was right, and you knew it." Renshaw didn't speak for a long moment, and when he finally did, it wasn't with denial, but weariness. "I buried that case 6 years ago because no one wanted to believe a man with clearance and a badge could disappear kids off a federal map," he said. "But I saw that mark too, and I remember the name. Voss, wildlife supervisor out of Jackson District. Resigned quietly. Cleared his files, no forwarding address. His cabin was never found." Edie leaned in. "Well, Jack Holloway may have just found it." Back in the woods, the wind shifted. Max growled, and Ava, trapped behind plywood walls and moldy blankets, heard it. Not the way you hear cars or voices or footsteps, but the way a heart hears rhythm, the way a body remembers something before the mind does, and when that sound reached her, she bolted upright, lips cracked, hands still bound, eyes wide with something that almost resembled hope. "The dog," she whispered, voice hoarse. "He's here." Nora stirred beside her, delirious, murmuring nonsense, skin burning under layers of dirty fabric, and Ava, who hadn't spoken more than 3 words in 2 days, pressed her ear to the cold floor and tapped again. 3 short knocks. The same pattern she'd been doing for hours. A signal, a prayer, a lifeline. And Max, outside, ears pricked, barked once a bark that split the trees. The man inside the cabin jerked towards the window, curse tumbling from his lips, hand reaching for the knife on the counter. Jack didn't wait. He kicked the back door off its hinges and rolled through the entry with one arm raised and one eye on Max, who had already lunged through the side wall in a blur of fur and teeth, catching the attacker mid-stride and dragging him down like gravity had teeth. The second man grabbed the girls, dragged them toward the truck waiting beyond the pines, but Jack was faster. He fired once, a warning shot into the snow, but the man didn't stop. So Jack tackled him hard enough to send them both into a drift, fists flying, breath coming in clouds of red and white. The world narrowing into pain and panic, and the high-pitched sound of Ava screaming her sister's name. It ended fast. Max held one man. Jack dropped the other. Ava broke the rope on her wrists and pulled Nora free. They ran, and then Jack staggered, blood darkening the snow beneath his coat, vision blurring, breath catching. Max limped to his side, muzzle stained with someone else's blood, eyes locked on Jack's face like he knew that if Jack went down now, the whole world would follow. Then came the sound they'd all been praying for, the low thump of rotor blades cutting the wind and a beam of floodlight pouring through the trees like dawn come early. Jack collapsed. Max didn't move. And somewhere behind them, the forest finally exhaled. Edie Bellamy hadn't opened the drawer in 6 years. Not since the morning she stood by a half-frozen ravine while men in yellow jackets muttered quietly into radios. Not since they said her son Simon must have slipped during a routine forestry patrol, and that maybe, just maybe, the animals got to him before the search teams did. Not since they handed her back a bag with his gloves and his badge, but no body, no journal, no answers. And still, she had known something was missing. Not just from the terrain they scoured, but from the way they stopped looking far too quickly, as if the truth was something they'd rather bury under snow than dig up with their hands. Now, as her fingers turned the key inside the small brass lock on the bottom drawer of her father's roll-top desk, she realized how badly her hands were shaking. Not from age or cold, but from that sense of knowing that had never quite left her. The one that whispered from the corner of her mind every time the wind shifted the trees in a way that reminded her of Simon's footsteps, or when the local paper printed yet another photo of yet another child gone missing from somewhere within a 100-mile radius of the same forest he once roamed. The journal was exactly where she left it, wrapped in an old dish towel printed with fading daisies, soft with time and neglect. The cover, once leather black and smooth, had dried and cracked, and when she opened it, the scent of cedar and graphite rose up like a memory, sharp and oddly intact. Inside, the pages bloomed with Simon's precise, urgent handwriting notes and sketches, questions scribbled in the margins, half-drawn maps of areas she didn't recognize, and at least 3 references to the same name, Voss. But it was the symbol that stopped her cold. She had seen it again, just yesterday in fact, on the drawing of a student from her after-school literacy group, a quiet boy named Robbie who rarely spoke above a whisper but liked to doodle animals and symbols during reading hour. His picture, done in bold blue crayon, had featured a crooked cabin, trees without leaves, and on the door drawn carefully, as if traced from something was a circle with jagged edges and a slash through the center. Edie had seen that exact symbol in Simon's journal 6 times. Sometimes beside hand-drawn tree markers, sometimes sketched next to dates and notes about logging permits that shouldn't exist, and once circled in red with a single line beneath. Same as marker near Ridge 8, not forestry, someone else's code. She closed the journal and grabbed her coat, the decision made before she even stood up, and within 20 minutes she was in the office of Captain Renshaw, the only man still in Willow Creek who hadn't called her crazy all those years ago, though he'd been powerless to help her then. Renshaw looked older now, gray at the temples, posture more rigid than she remembered, but his eyes, always sharp, narrowed as she spread the journal open on his desk, flipped to the page with the circled mark and said, "Tell me you haven't seen this before." He didn't pretend, didn't fumble for words. He just exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a thumb across his brow before speaking in that low, steady voice of his that had once calmed victims and spooked suspects in equal measure. "We found it once," he said, "outside Jackson District, during the Lantry Creek investigation. 2 teens went missing on a hiking trip. A woman disappeared from a gas station 2 counties over, and all we had were overlapping wilderness zones and sightings of a man with a forestry badge that didn't match any department database." Edie nodded slowly. Voss. Renshaw's jaw tightened. Raymond Voss. Worked for state lands back in the late 90s, then took a private contract with a land development firm no one had heard of. Disappeared 5 years ago after a complaint from another ranger guy claimed Voss had access to keys for locked trails, utility sheds, and unlisted sites. And no one followed up. "They buried it," Renshaw said, voice hard. "Too many jurisdictions, no proof, no body." Edie leaned forward. "You have one now. That drawing from Robbie? Same mark. And Jack Holloway, he's found something." The moment she said his name, Renshaw reached for his radio. Across town, in the recovery wing of the Willow Creek Medical Center, Max lay curled beneath Jack's cot, one paw wrapped in gauze, his body still safe for the slow rise and fall of his chest, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the beeping of machines that tracked the man lying above him. Jack hadn't woken since the surgery. The doctor said the bleeding had stopped, that his vitals were stable, that his body had responded well to transfusion, and that the cold had actually slowed the worst of the blood loss. But none of that meant anything to Miriam Holloway, who stood at the foot of the bed like a sentry, her weathered hands wrapped tight around the brim of her old felt hat, her eyes locked on her son's face with the kind of fury only a mother can summon when the world tries to take what little she has left. She didn't speak when Edie entered, just nodded once in acknowledgement, and then went back to watching Jack breathe. Eddie crouched beside Max, her knees popping, her hand reaching gently toward the dog's good paw. Max blinked at her, made no sound, didn't move, but when she whispered, "We found the mark again," his ears flicked forward. Edie opened the journal on the floor, pointed to the page with the map Simon had sketched, a crude rendering of a stretch of forest marked by dots and slashes, labeled with coordinates and underlined dates, and waited. Max stared at it, then let out the softest, lowest growl she had ever heard from him. Renshaw entered behind her a moment later, holding a printed image and one hand-drawn footage from the cabin Jack had stormed alone. 2 figures dragging a third across a floor. A timestamp, a thermal signature, a match to the coordinates in Simon's journal, down to the curve of the riverbank nearby. "They've been using the same site," Renshaw said, voice tight. "At least 3 times in the last 5 years. The kids that were never found, they were brought there first. And Jack found it by accident," Miriam whispered, finally speaking. Edie shook her head. "No, not by accident. Max brought him there." Snow still framed the edges of Jack Holloway's hospital room, melting slow as breath under the early spring sun that filtered in through a frost-rimmed window, and though the rest of Willow Creek had begun to move on, returning to routines and rituals, grocery runs and school drop-offs, the 4th floor of the regional medical center remained suspended in time, caught between what had nearly happened and what still might. Jack lay motionless beneath a thin white sheet, the edges tucked with clinical precision, while monitors blinked quietly beside him, measuring the slow, stubborn rhythm of a heart that had refused to quit even when the forest tried to silence it. He hadn't woken in 2 days. The surgeon said the blood loss was severe, the stab wound narrowly missing his liver, and that if Max hadn't barked when he did, the chopper might have arrived too late. Miriam Holloway sat vigil by the window, her fingers locked tight around the base of a ceramic coffee cup she'd refilled 4 times but never sipped from. And when nurses came in to check the IV drip or adjust the compression cuffs on his legs, she nodded politely but never stood, never let go of the space she was holding. Max didn't leave either. The old dog hadn't moved more than a few inches since they wheeled Jack into the room, his bandaged paw stretched in front of him, eyes fixed not on the door, but on Jack's right hand, as if willing it to twitch, to lift, to offer some small sign that the bond between them hadn't frayed beneath the weight of blood and silence. Ava came just after dawn. She wore the same oversized coat from the night of the rescue, the sleeves still stained from where she'd clutched Nora's fevered body too tightly for too long. She said nothing as she entered, just walked to the side of the bed, stood on tiptoe, and slipped her small fingers into Jack's. Her lips moved just slightly, and though no sound came at first, the heart monitor's pattern shifted, if only for a beat. "He found us," she finally whispered. "He didn't stop." The nurse, who had been watching from the hallway, quietly wrote something down. Max's ear flicked. Miriam closed her eyes. 200 miles north, in a dim-lit diner clinging to the shoulder of Route 81, Raymond Voss, known now by the name Daniel Crow, sipped bitter coffee from a chipped mug and traced the lip of the ceramic with a calloused finger as he watched the parking lot through half-lowered lids. The waitress hadn't asked questions when he paid cash, hadn't looked twice at the van with tinted windows, hadn't cared that he didn't order food. Just coffee, black, and lots of it. He liked places like this. Anonymous, tired, forgotten. But what Voss didn't know, what the waitress didn't know, was that his face had been scanned by a state-operated fuel camera less than 2 hours earlier, matched to an inactive ID in a sealed cold case from the Jackson District Forestry Department, and flagged to every law enforcement agency across Tennessee and Kentucky. He never saw the cruisers coming. They boxed him in before he'd even made it out of the lot, one at the rear, another at the drive exit, and a third that came from the west with lights already flashing. When officers approached, hands on sidearms, Voss didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't ask why. He simply set his mug down, adjusted his cap, and muttered, "Took you long enough." Inside the van, they found what they feared: duct tape, syringes, a case of tranquilizer vials, burner phones, a thumb drive containing digital folders labeled with names and dates, some matching open cases, others likely never reported. One folder held scans of journal pages, hand-drawn maps, and coordinates nearly identical to those Simon Bellamy had recorded 6 years ago. Tucked into the final folder, behind a worn photograph of the Sycamore Ridge trailhead, was a single Polaroid of a young man in a green uniform, smiling, unaware. Simon Bellamy. When Captain Renshaw received the confirmation, he didn't announce it. He simply printed the case file, slid it into a manila folder, and walked it down the hall to Jack's room, where Max still lay unmoving, and Miriam had just refilled her cold coffee again. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Ava still holding Jack's hand, her head bowed like she was whispering prayers she'd made up herself. Then Jack blinked, just once, but it was enough. Max stood. Ava gasped, the monitor spiked softly, and Jack's fingers curled around the child's. He didn't speak, his lips too dry, his throat too raw, but his eyes flicked toward the window where Max stood, tail beginning to thump softly against the tile, and in that moment, the hospital room filled not with noise, but with something far more powerful. Recognition. The unspoken kind. Ava reached into her coat and pulled something from her pocket. It was small, round, plastic, the kind of toy metal handed out at school assemblies or fun fairs. She'd kept it through everything, and now she clipped it gently onto Max's collar, where it dangled against the bandage like it belonged. "You're my hero," she said. "Not just a dog." Miriam sat down for the first time in hours. Max exhaled through his nose and curled back onto the blanket. And outside, the last of the snow finally gave way to thaw. 6 weeks after the rescue, the snow that once silenced Willow Creek had finally surrendered to the thaw, leaving behind a town that was still healing in quiet, visible ways, boot prints in soft earth where frost used to be, porch chairs dragged back into sunlight, children's voices returning to parks once cordoned off by caution tape. The woods no longer felt haunted, though some still hesitated to glance too deep into the tree line, and at the edge of Alder Hill, where the ridge curved gently above the town, the people of Willow Creek gathered under a pale morning sky, not to relive the pain, but to honor the ones who had walked through it and returned. It wasn't a grand event. There were no banners, no helicopters, no national cameras, just folding chairs on damp grass, small American flags held in mittened hands, a podium borrowed from the middle school auditorium, and a few speakers who stumbled more over emotion than over words. The audience was made up of neighbors and classmates, the sheriff's department, forest rangers in crisp greens, nurses from the hospital, and strangers who had driven for hours to stand and bear witness to something that didn't quite fit inside headlines. At the front stood Jack Holloway, shoulders broad beneath a civilian coat. The bruises around his ribs faded to yellow and gray, a cane in his left hand that he used more for balance than necessity now, though the ache in his hip still flared with every change in weather. He didn't wear a uniform, hadn't since the department put him on extended medical leave, but his name was stitched onto the pocket of his jacket, and when Mayor Lansing cleared his throat to address the crowd, all eyes turned to the man beside the podium. Max sat at his feet. The old dog wore a fitted vest, navy with silver trim, that covered the healed scarring along his rib cage. The medal Ava had given him still hung from his collar, and below it, a new tag had been added, polished and engraved with the words "Valor in Silence." He didn't pant, didn't bark. He simply sat, ears forward, eyes scanning the crowd like he knew the moment belonged to him, and he would not waste it. "Some acts don't ask to be remembered," Mayor Lansing said, voice low but steady. "But we remember them anyway, not because they seek attention, but because they remind us what it looks like when courage refuses to ask permission." He stepped down from the platform then, crossed to Max, and knelt to pin the official medal onto the vest's shoulder strap. Max didn't move, didn't react, except to blink slowly, as if acknowledging something larger than the medal pinned to his side. The applause came slowly, then all at once. Not thunderous, not rowdy, but reverent. Ava and Nora stood near the front, holding hands. Nora still wore gloves, even in the warming weather, and Ava had a plastic bracelet on her wrist that she tugged at when she got nervous. Behind them stood Cassie, her face pale with pride and something like disbelief, like she still couldn't quite grasp how they had all made it out, whole in ways no one had expected. Edie Bellamy arrived late. She stood at the back of the crowd holding a small wooden box, the kind her son Simon had once used to collect river stones and tree bark samples from long hikes. The box now bore a carved version of the Watcher's mark, once a symbol that had haunted her dreams, now smoothed into something quieter, more personal. When Ava saw her, she walked over without hesitation, stared at the box for a long moment, and asked in a voice barely above the breeze, "What does it mean now?" Edie didn't have to think. "It means someone listened," she said. News of the rescue had traveled beyond the county within days, but it wasn't until after the arrest of Raymond Voss, now known publicly by his real name, linked to half a dozen cold cases spanning 2 states, that national networks picked up the story. There were segments on primetime, think pieces in major outlets, petitions calling for legislation, and a wave of support that culminated in the passage of a bill funding expanded canine trauma rehabilitation and early retirement placement programs in rural departments. From it all rose a movement, one no one quite named until it already had a name: Dogs Who Stayed. It was never about obedience. It was about presence. It was about those who waited, who stayed beside the broken and the missing, who followed faint trails into the dark when others turned back. It was about loyalty without command, about guardianship without orders. And more than anything, it was about what Max had done without needing to be told. He never wore the vest again. Didn't need to. He spent his mornings watching squirrels from the porch, and his afternoons trailing behind Ava and Nora as they biked down Sycamore Lane. When they read books aloud on the lawn, he lay with his head on Ava's lap. When they laughed, he wagged his tail, slow and steady, as if to say he heard them. Jack walked better now. Not perfectly, not pain-free, but he no longer feared the bend of the woods or the silence of dusk. He kept busy lectured at the academy now and then, helped train rookies on terrain navigation and behavioral analysis, but mostly he lived quietly. He wrote more, sat longer, and each time Max padded over to rest beside his chair, Jack let the moment stretch. Let it stay. At the edge of the Sycamore Ridge Trail, where once there had been only shadow and rot, a sign had been placed. Just a simple wooden plaque. In honor of those who were lost and those who were louder than silence. Some days, Edie walked there alone. She brought the box. Sometimes she brought wildflowers. Once she brought a drawing Robbie had done, a new version of the Watcher's Mark, but this time the circle was whole. And when she closed her eyes, she could still hear them, not the ones who vanished, but the ones who returned. Footsteps. Not loud, but steady. The kind that don't just survive the woods. The kind that walk people out of them.